Gary says, okay, how about this? You've got a boy and a girl, they're age 12 years old. What happens over the next 2 years is during puberty, the boy will put on muscle and he will get wider shoulders, etc., become more muscular and lose fat, whereas the female will get larger and she will gain fat and she'll gain it in specific areas. So he said that's not because she's eating more and exercising less, it's because of hormones.
Gary Taubes is talking about in a ketogenic diet is very similar to an Atkins-style diet. And so I think the main difference is he just takes it a little further. Atkins was getting into ketosis, but I think at 70%. I don't think Atkins was as rigid. I don't remember. I read his book many, many years ago. And he was essentially the Gary Taubes of his time, and where had a huge Atkins had a huge following. And he got really a lot of traction with the low-carb diet. And from my understanding of seeing his death certificate, he died of heart disease. And he was overweight. And it's hard to stay on a ketogenic low-carb diet for years.
If we go back to the Plains Indians, let's just pick the 1700s before anyone but trappers was out with the Plains Indians, or pick 1600s if we have to. Are we thinking that the Plains Indians, if their diet consisted of 60% buffalo entrails and fat and meat and tendons and marrow, had higher rates of cardiac events than the natives who were living without substantial dependence on one meat product, like the Plains Indians may have been for most of their lives and may have been dying off earlier because of that?
Hi, this is Sifu Slim, author of The Aging Athlete. In this book, you're going to get to hear about two different groups of former high-performance athletes. One group, which is made up of 90% of the former athletes, does not do physical activity on a regular basis and tends to suffer the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle. The other group, which is made up of 10% of the former athletes, is doing physical activity on a regular basis and tends to thrive through the aging process, or at least has a better chance at coping with the aging process. We could have taken these folks to a lab and done all kinds of tests on them. Instead, we slowed them down and sat them down and asked them, in their own words, to describe why they're wired the way they are, so that we all, former athletes and non-athletes, can use some of their inspirational and motivational and mindset lessons in our own lives. I hope you pick up a copy today. You can go to theagingathlete.com, and when you have a chance to read it, I'd love to hear back from you to find out what your thoughts are on the stories of these aging athletes.
Hi there, Sifu Slim here, and today we're going to be doing a reaction video to a discussion about keto diets and Gary's book, The Case for Keto. And the conversation is between Dr. Mark Hyman, MD, and Gary Taubes, noted health and science journalist. Steve Abbey is coming to us live from Santa Barbara, California. Say hello, Steve, and tell us a little bit about you.
Hello, Sifu, and good to be on the show with you. I'm a health and nutrition, I'll say somebody who's been studying it for 30 years and studied it in college, and then just continued, even though I've been doing other businesses, continued to study it and do a very deep dive. Gary Taubes is one of the people that I have really studied and find a fascinating individual. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
All right, we're going to go right into the audio. of Dr. Mark Hyman and Gary Taubes in the intro part of the video that they did called Who Should Eat Keto and Why?
Times magazine article, which was called Big Fat Lie, right? Wasn't it called Big Fat Lie?
What if it's all been a big fat lie? Yes.
Yeah.
And hi, Mark.
Hi, Gary. Gary was the co-founder and director of the Nutrition Science Initiative, or NUSI. He's the author of many books, which are really deep dives into issues that we all care about. The Case Against Sugar, which I'm a huge fan of, Why We Get Fat, which is a very concise little book that explains exactly why we gain weight, and Good Calories, Bad Calories. Again, these are just, in my mind, some of the top books in the nutrition health field, have been most investigative books I've seen about the truth of the science, without any filters or any sort of obfuscation through the ways that we usually get our data. He is also a contributing article writer for Discover, staff writer. He's written many articles and cover articles for Nutrition Health, the New York Times Magazine. He's written for The Atlantic, Esquire, and has been in many best of anthologies, including the Best of American Science Writing. And he's received lots of awards, 3 Science and Society Journalism Awards, and National Association of Science Writers. He's the recipient of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Investigator Award in Health Policy Research, which is pretty damn good for a journalist. He lives in Oakland, California, and he is one of the smartest guys I know. Welcome to the Doctor's Pharmacy.
Mark, thank you. And thank you for that great introduction.
Okay.
Even me, even I'm willing to listen to what I have to say now.
Yeah, exactly.
So good, jovial frame of mind from two highly intense, deep dive type people. Any opening comments from you, Steve?
Well, there's not much really to comment there. Gary is a very well sought after, his writing style is fantastic. He has won numerous accolades, and and he has a lot to say that I think he's brought out in a very positive way. So
yeah, my comment, Steve, is that his article in the New York Times Magazine, I believe 2002, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? I think it really was pivotal. It was necessary at the time, after coming from the 20th century, where you basically took grandma's wisdom, your aunt's wisdom, that dated back to the farmers and the people who farmed and hunted and survived all throughout the world, especially the European immigrants who came to America and the colonies and then the United States. And they had all of these things that work: functional diet, functional medicine, functional ways to raise animals, to deal with nature, to deal with rivers and damming rivers, all these things. And almost in a period of one generation, 20 to 30 years, you saw a lot of this get erased. And in one of our close contacts, Jason Jewell, talks a lot about this type of thing. He studied the industrialization of farming, and how the statistics went something like 95% of people in 1900, the year of 1900, something around there, worked in some relationship to food, growing it, moving it, whatever. And in a very short time, one generation, all that had changed, and people went to industrial jobs, service-oriented jobs, and they lost connection with nature, with animals, with growing a garden, with butchering hogs, all these types of things. So his article is coming out in 2002, a time where people had lost all connection to what real food was, whole food was. Would you agree with that?
well, there was a lot to unpack there, and I would say I thought it was an interesting article, and it's what if it's all been a big fat lie, and it's questioning. The thing is, I don't think what he wrote there was accurate. And at the time, we didn't have the data to really support one way or the other, from my perspective. Now we do. The data is very clear. and yet he is still promoting that. So was that that was an article that helped to spawn a movement. And I think he's very attached to that argument for whatever reasons that he has. And it's a very big thing to open people's mind to that idea. And I think it's not about what I'm hearing you say, where it's all about, our forefathers and how they were connected. I didn't read that in his article. He was going to how we're actually eating, and eating a more whole food diet, albeit a low carb, high fat diet. So I have my thoughts on it. So
I guess what I'm saying is that as the world got more sedentary, and as percentage of carbs, especially highly processed carbs and things like corn syrup, invented in the 50s and really brought to market in the late 70s, I think what he did was open up the conversation to how our diet changed. And at the same time, we became much more sedentary. So where our grandparents and great-grandparents, if they were doing manual labor, might have been able to burn through calories and might not have started out with a lot of adipose tissue and all of these things like diabetes and obesity. The change of our lifestyle, becoming more sedentary and eating all this processed food, I think somebody had to go out and look into that and find out if there was other research that predated the time where he was writing that article. Those are my thoughts. So you want me to hit the? I'll hit the video here. We'll see what happens next.
Go ahead.
Well, we're in an interesting moment in society where we're fatter than ever. We keep talking about it for decades. I have been, you have been, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Our government recommendations and policies don't seem to be solving the problem. And certainly the advice we're getting from our doctors and nutritionists often is not effective either, which is eat less and exercise more. It's just calories in, calories out. Have you written a lot about this in the past? And recently there's been a real movement to look at radical different ways of solving some of the biggest problems we have, which is diabetes and obesity, using a ketogenic diet. And for those who are listening, a ketogenic diet is essentially a 70% fat diet, cuts out almost all carbohydrates, and has moderate amounts of protein. It's definitely not exactly an Atkins diet. It's a little bit different than that, and it's been around for a long time in medicine, but it's recently being used for all sorts of conditions, from cancer to diabetes to Alzheimer's, and it's been used for decades for epilepsy by neurologists. So you really become an expert on these issues as a non-doctor scientist. You probably have read more of the scientific papers and more of the data on this than most doctors or scientists. And
So if you listen to Gary Taubes talk about the research and 5 years to write one book, and that wasn't enough, he probably could be, it's arguable that for someone that's appeared on the media and talked about it, that he's probably read more of that history in the last 15 years. Or now it's 2002, and before that, so it'd be 22 to 25 years, probably more than anyone on the planet that we know about. Would that sound accurate to you, Steve?
I can only imagine. I don't know what his level of investigation is. That being said, he's a bright guy, and I would assume he's done tremendous amounts of research.
So the argument about Atkins and then later a keto diet and what it's good at, neurologists are using it for Alzheimer's. Atkins used it for people that were expanding with too much fat and other ailments, even sleep disorders, high carb and high corn syrup, high processed food, and obesity leading to GERD, leading to sleep apnea, leading to snoring, all these types of things. Those are correlations that can be drawn. And Atkins, who claimed to have had 20,000 patients, he helped with his diet, which could be true, and had those people, some of them are probably still alive and can attest to that. And I'm sure the people who've looked in Atkins either know or he was telling the truth or that he was not telling the truth. These things, I think, are fascinating subjects, and well, I'd love to hear your point of view on some of this, Steve.
Well, what Gary Taubes is talking about in a ketogenic diet is very similar to an Atkins-style diet. And so it's I think the main difference is he just takes it a little further. Atkins was getting into ketosis, but I think it's 70%. I don't think Atkins was as rigid. I don't remember. I read his book many, many years ago. And he was essentially the Gary Taubes of his time, and where had a huge Atkins had a huge following. And he got really a lot of traction with the low carb diet. And from my understanding of seeing his death certificate, he died of heart disease and he was overweight. And it's hard to stay on a ketogenic low carb diet for years. And it can cause real problems for people. So we'll get into that later. I don't want to preface it too much.
You want to run some more video?
Sure.
Okay.
Busting a lot of the big myths that really we are facing in the world of food. And the first myth that you really took on back in 2002 with that article, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie, was that we should all be eating a low-fat diet to lose weight because fat has more calories than carbs. So if we all ate Snackwell cookies, we lose weight, except for one thing, the opposite happened. So what led you in that whole trajectory of this sort of examination of the low-fat movement to swing so far the other way to write a book called The Case for Keto, Rethinking Weight Control and the Science and Practice of Low-Carb, High-Fat Eating? What made you go, I need to write a book about this?
Okay, well, when I first...
By the way, this is the book. Everybody should get it. It's really, really awesome. It's got a nice red cover. You can't miss it. And it's beautifully written. It's great prose. It's just awesome.
Yeah, thank you again. So so that New York Times Magazine article was a third of my investigative reports on nutrition. So I started off just by chance writing about salt and blood pressure for the journal Science, and I had no idea there was an enormous, very vitriolic controversy in the field, the basis of which was that there's surprisingly little evidence to advise us all to eat less salt. And while I was doing that work, I realized that one of the worst scientists I'd ever interviewed, and I had written a book called Bad Science, had taken credit not just for the low salt diet we were all eating in the 1990s, but the low fat diet as well. So then I did a investigative piece for Science. It took me a year. Published. It was called The Soft Science of Dietary Fat. And it just turned out that, again, the evidence, the idea that dietary fat causes heart disease was an interesting hypothesis that was launched kind of in the beginning of the 20th century and then took hold in the 1950s and never panned out. The experiment after experiment to try and test it, and the experiments, sometimes they showed that people ate less fat, lived a little longer. Sometimes they showed that they died a little more prematurely. And scientists fell in love with the hypotheses, as scientists often do. The public health establishment in this country started promoting it, and we believed it ever since. So in 2002, when I did this New York Times Magazine article, initially the idea was that I just wanted to find out what started the obesity epidemic. It was our awareness of it was relatively new. Obesity rates shoot up in this country roughly in the 1980s. And it coincides with some shifts to nutritional advice. We go from eating sugar to eating high fructose corn syrup. So that was one hypothesis. Michael Pollan bought into that idea and was promoting it. And the other was just that we started promoting this idea that a low-fat diet was a healthy diet and that carbohydrates were hard, healthy diet foods, when carbohydrates had always been perceived as kind of uniquely fattening. Starches, breads, and sugars, the kind of thing that, people would say they go right to my hips or right to my gut. So I was reporting that story for the New York Times Magazine, and while I was doing it, it turned out I stumbled on 5 clinical trials, really the first 5 that had ever been done, comparing an Atkins ketogenic diet to a low-fat diet.
Interesting trajectory of his research, bad science, and he said, if you think that the field in physics and these other sciences is bad, you ought to take a look at dietary science. The studies that they're using are the ones that they're promoting weren't correctly done, and they're landing on false hypotheses. That's what someone told him. He looked into it. He found that to be true in the way he perceived these studies and the research and the fact that the medical establishment was using those studies. So that was Gary's point of view and still is. Your thoughts, Steve?
Well, he's not saying which science he's talking about, at least in this in this interview. And when you're looking at what he said in terms of there was no correlation, some showed more, some showed less, with more dietary fat. And I don't know what he just said, but the studies that I believe he's referring to were done by Ancel Keys, because he's been a big critic of Ancel Keys. And I don't know how you look at the data, the country data, and get that there's no correlation. And it's, once again, it's very cherry picking, because in the studies that Ancel Keys put together, he put together a graph based on countries and heart disease risk based on the amount of fat that they were getting. And it was somewhat all over. Taubes said there is no correlation, but I'm looking at it and it's clearly going up and to the right, which means that as you get more fat, as countries are having more fat, they're having more cardiac events. However, it got way more refined when it looked at how much more animal fats and cardiac events. As you got more and more animal fats, the cardiac, it was a very clear up and to the right. So in other words, as you got more animal fat, you had a clear correlation with much more heart disease risk. So I don't understand how you can say this is bad science without showing where it's going off. And I don't see that clearly being done ever by him. So those Ancel Keys, in my opinion, was a gentleman way before his time. He came up with tremendous amounts of thought process that had never been looked at before. And yet Taubes is saying he was completely off center. However, his basic premise of what he was just proposing has been demonstrated multiple times, especially in Finland. If you look at the Finnish transformation from a country that had the highest incidence of heart disease risk, and drastically in certain areas between the ages of, I think it was 18 and 64, it went down as a country. Now, normally, if you have a 5% decrease in the risk of heart disease on a countrywide basis, as a political person, you're thinking we've done a great job. They had an 85% for that age group, an 85% lowering of the heart disease risk. It was fantastic. Never been done in history in any other country. And it was following to a great degree what Ancel Keys was saying. They took dairies to berries is what their procedure was. So
you're saying that in the studies that you've looked at, done contemporaneously and even back in time, like Ancel Keys, there's a direct correlation, if not causality, from increased meat consumption and heart and cardiac events.
Yes. And clearly has been shown multiple times over. And so to center your diet without addressing those studies that are multiple, to center your diet around, in most cases, the ketogenic diet is mostly a meat-centric diet, or it can be I think it's called Pagan, which is a pescatarian vegan, where it's very fat centric. So people still go into ketosis. That being said, the vast majority of people that are doing keto are doing a very high meat centric diet. And so we'll get into the all-cause mortality that's associated with that in a minute.
And any of the studies done, you mentioned Finland, and I had stepped out when you were finishing that. Any of these studies done on people who were living balanced lifestyles, like let's say people who worked using their bodies for quite often during the day, like farmers in Finland that had a high consumption of animal product, meat, and eggs. Has any study been done on those people who are moving and were balanced and were getting sunlight and nature, et cetera, in terms of their cardiac events?
So in the Finnish study, it was a population study. So, and it was a population program that was just translated into an analysis of how, as a country, they could radically shift the health of their nation, which they did. And it increased their lifespan substantially. And the biggest thing is it lowered the cardiac risk. However, they did not go into the specifics as I remember, because I've gone through that study. I don't remember them going into breaking it down by exercise or sunlight or type of occupation. However, those studies have been done. And there was a huge study published in JAMA looking at exercise and cancer risk. And as people got more and more, until it got too much, but the cancer rate went down by, according to the article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, by 39%. That was the top level, but it gets bad if you start doing, ultra marathons and things like that. Then you look at heart disease risk, same thing. And so you have, as you get more and more exercise, until you get to the point where you're actually doing DNA damage, you're having more and more benefit from it. Very few Americans are getting to the point where they're actually having a detrimental side to it.
Okay, onward we go.
The American Heart Association was telling us to eat, and none of these studies had been published yet, but they'd all been discussed in conferences, and they all found the same thing, that if you tell someone to eat a high-fat diet rich in saturated fat and animal products, but don't eat carbohydrates, and you could eat as much as you want. So, the eggs and bacon for breakfast, and a T-bone steak with salad for lunch, and a half a roast chicken with salad or green vegetables for dinner, and you smother it in butter and oil, and all the things we were supposed to not do. And if you tell someone to do that, not only do they lose weight, but their heart disease risk factors improve. And all 5 studies showed the same thing. And they were, from clinical trials up and down the East Coast, basically. And it suggested, this is the joke, it suggested that everything we know about, or everything we're being told about diet and health was wrong. Because, the Atkins diet, again, was a ketogenic. It was a ketogenic diet. That's why Atkins was crucified for promoting it. He got very wealthy, but the medical establishment didn't appreciate him promoting a radical idea like ketosis. So anyway, I wrote that article. I argued that maybe dietary fat wasn't the problem, maybe carbs were, and I've been following that ever since. And I actually didn't want to call my book The Case for Keto, because I didn't want to distract from the major points. That was sort of the, originally the book was called How to Think About How to Eat. And then our mutual friend, Mark Bittman, came out with a book called How to Eat 6 weeks before mine was originally scheduled to be published. Theirs came out in mid-March of 2020, so they got swallowed up by COVID. And mine was not scheduled until late April, so we could delay it. And when we delayed it, we changed the title to so they wouldn't compete. And it became The Case for Keto. Well, I didn't fight it, because I've basically been making the case for ketogenic diet since that original 2002 article.
It's a pretty profound idea. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to put all this in context. And the context is, if carbohydrates are fattening, those of us who get fat easily can't eat them. And then the extreme version of carb restriction.
So another point that he harps on is that he has a brother, I think 2 years older or a year older, and his brother couldn't gain weight very easily. And they both, what he says, they ate as much as humanly possible, whereas Gary was a chubby kid and was able to gain weight. And during his time at Columbia playing football, he got up to 225 pounds at 6'2", I think he is. And so he had an easier time putting on weight. And then when people say, okay, that's just an anecdote and that we can't quantify how much you ate and how much your brother ate, so we're not using the calories in, calories out argument, or you're trying to invalidate that, but the medical science is saying that we're going to continue using it, the predominant medical science. Gary says, okay, how about this? You've got a boy and a girl, they're age 12 years old. What happens over the next 2 years is during puberty, the boy will put on muscle and he will get wider shoulders, etc., become more muscular and lose fat, whereas the female will get larger and she will gain fat, and she'll gain it in specific areas. So he said that's not because she's eating more and exercising less, it's because of hormones. So that's what he's touting in much of his talks. He talks a lot about insulin. He says it's a hormonal situation, it's a hormonal imbalance. It's not because we're eating more and exercising less. Over to Steve for his points.
So I am in total agreement with him there. And it is something that he has brought to the forefront. And my hat's off to him for that. I think he has really brought that point, because why we're looking at the calories in, calories out, it's just clearly wrong. And that can be just disproven so easily. Now, does it make a difference in how many calories somebody has? Of course it does. That being said, how people gain weight is not clearly, he makes the point. If over the course of several years, somebody gains 10 pounds and it's on average 50 calories a day, all they have to do is reduce their calorie intake by 50 calories and they'll go right back to where they were before. Or all they have to do is reduce it by 500 calories and they'll go back 10 times faster. It doesn't work that way. And that's clearly true. And he has clearly shown that. Taubes has. That being said, he has an insulin model of obesity, and he has promoted that. And he has actually financed that from the Nutrition Science Initiative, where he raised $40 million and had a study published by an NIH, a very renowned researcher, and it came out saying that it failed to show what, and I can even have, there's a line at the end of it, which I thought was very interesting. Therefore, our data do not support the carbohydrate insulin model and body fat loss in response to isocaloric ketogenic diet. In other words, the very study that he put together, the resource with, which is very capable to put together $40 million and then do a study, but he doesn't talk about that study because he doesn't agree with the results. Mm-hmm. He has to address this much clearer, because the very study that he funded showed that his theory is wrong. Normally, who funds the study makes a huge difference in how that study is promoted. But this was a very famous researcher and he stuck to his guns. So let's just say there's a lot more to this.
Yeah, the physics law, and Gary has a degree in physics, is the law of thermodynamics. And he said the problem with that, using that and transferring that over to the argument about fat gain, is that there's no arrow of causality. And he describes that in almost all of his talks, the question of thermodynamics and why it doesn't work in this case, according to Gary Taubes. Anything else before we go on?
Well, he talks about eating eggs, bacon, T-bone steak, half a chicken. That's what I was talking about earlier, about a very animal protein centric diet. And that is a very typical one. Now, when you talk about bacon, that according to the WHO, that's a group 1 carcinogen, right up there with asbestos and uranium. So when in my opinion, you've got to be very careful. And then he talks about smothering it with butter and oil. So that's how you get to a very high fat diet. And butter and oil are fats that have very little nutrition by themselves. They're a refined fat. Even butter, I would consider a refined fat. It is stripped off of the whole milk that comes, right? And I won't say that it doesn't have nutrition, but if you look at your artery function, when somebody takes butter or oil, like coconut oil or even olive oil without antioxidants shocks the system. So you can measure your artery function in real time with something called flow medial dilation. So in real time, you can see how much your arteries can expand and contract. And that is critically important. Your heart pumps blood, right? That being said, all your arteries and veins and everything, they're not just passive tubes that it goes through. They participate in the movement of that blood. That's why hardening of the arteries is so bad. You want everything to flow, and it helps the whole way across by expanding and contracting. And when you eat butter or olive oil, it cuts the amount that you expand and contract in real time by about 50%, which is very unhealthy, especially for somebody at high risk for heart disease.
So the meat question that we talked about 10 minutes ago, if someone gets meat that's farm raised in a holistic way, it's higher in omega-3, less toxins, processing grass, let's say it's a steer, processing grass and getting new pasture, clean pasture, living in a natural, holistic way. Do the tests on those come out with similar numbers to these inflammatory markers and cardiac events, or are they significantly better?
Well, it probably depends drastically on the meat that you're talking about. So there have been studies on wild meats, and if you look at wild meat, oftentimes they're 3% fat. That is not what you're getting from a dairy cow or a chicken today. These are raised to be well marbled with huge amounts of fat on them. So it's a very different thing. Also, they're not as polluted with toxins, and if depending on where you're talking about. So is it going to be better what you just described? Absolutely. Are there still going to be issues? Absolutely. That being said, I'm not saying all meat is bad. I'm just saying the way the vast majority of the meat and I'll say dairy, the way it's being done in this country is not healthy. So would it be much better to get, let's say, buffalo meat or something like that? Absolutely. Would it be better to get wild game of some sort? Absolutely. They even still have their problems, but there's a balancing act, and you can have a very healthy diet with those included.
If we go back to the Plains Indians, let's just pick the 1700s before anyone but trappers was out with the Plains Indians, or pick 1600s if we have to. Are we thinking that the Plains Indians, if their diet consisted of 60% buffalo entrails and fat and meat and tendons and marrow, had higher rates of cardiac events than the natives who were living without substantial dependence on one meat product, like the Plains Indians may have been for most of their lives and may have been dying off earlier because of that? Is that thinking that you would agree with?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, so Indians that were living in nature, connected with nature in a group support system of a tribe, outside, getting tremendous amounts of vitamin D, living in a natural way with zero chemical toxins of any sort, and having a very overall healthy diet, with the predominant amount of their diet being whole plant foods. But then having, when they would have a kill with the buffalo or whatever, they would often have a lot of it, and then they would do things to it to make it store, like essentially creating beef jerky. Was that a healthy diet? Was that a healthy lifestyle? I'll say that is a very healthy lifestyle for the way they were living. So in my opinion, that was a very low to the ground and staying with what they knew and how they had been doing it for millennia.
Got it. Back to Taubes and Mark Hyman.
Is a ketogenic diet, but for 90 years, people have been insisting we get fat because we eat too much. Mm-hmm. And you and I and others have been arguing you get fat because of the carbohydrate content of the diet. And some of us just, if we want to reverse that process, we basically have to restrict or abstain from them entirely. And then you replace the calories with fat. Now you're doing a keto diet and you're fatted.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing that you would have been told 195 years ago. When,
yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, this has been around for a while. In fact, our good friend David Ludwig was a Harvard professor, who's a clinical trialist in obesity and insulin resistance. Mm-hmm. He says we don't get fat because we overeat. We overeat because we're fat. And what he means by that is that when you start eating carbohydrates, you get hungry fat growing in your abdomen. And it's not just fat there holding up your pants. It's actually hungry fat that makes you hungry and eat more carbohydrates. So it's a vicious cycle, and it causes fat storage, slows your metabolism, increases hunger, and locks the fat in the fat cells. It's literally a one-way turnstile. Once the fat gets in, which comes from the sugar, is turned into fat, it can't get out. So it's kind of a disaster. And he said something to me once, which just blew my mind and made it all make sense to me. He says, remember your training about type 1 diabetics. Type 1 diabetics, an autoimmune disease where the pancreas is damaged and you cannot make insulin. These people have, we call it polydipsia, polyphagia, and polyuria, right? So they're constantly thirsty because they're peeing out all the sugar and salt and everything, but they're hungry, they're starving all the time, which is polyphagia. And that means that they can eat 10 or 20,000 calories a day and they will not gain a pound. In fact, they will lose weight. So why is that? It's because they have no insulin, and you need insulin to gain weight. And the whole key to keto is that it shuts off that insulin. And so, one of the whole issues here is this whole calorie myth, which you dissected in your book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. Can you take us down a little bit of why we're still so stuck on this? Why, in fact, David Ludwig sent me a paper from the American, I think, Endocrinological Society that was relatively recent by a whole panel of experts on obesity, very renowned people. And they all came down and said, it's all about the calories. And I was like, I thought we were over that one. So
it's not just all about the calories, because they're willing to accept that counting calories doesn't really help anyone anymore. It's this idea that it's all about energy balance.
Right.
So what David Ludwig is saying, the idea is, you have the different foods have different effects on our hormonal status, and whether or not we accumulate fat is determined primarily by hormones, insulin and glucagon. So insulin is the dominant one, and glucagon is a sort of a counter hormone. So if some foods stimulate insulin, carbohydrate-rich foods and protein to a lesser extent, carbohydrates only stimulate insulin, protein stimulates glucagon, which works against insulin, the fat tissue. So it's sort of, the argument is obesity is a hormonal thing. You cause your fat cells to accumulate excess fat, and that in turn steals calories from the rest of your body that you would use for fuel, and so you're constantly hungry.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. Insulin, glucagon, and people still talking about the calorie balance model to this day. And I've talked to older athletes, people in their 70s and the 80s, and they've told me within the last 10 years it's all about calories in, calories out. So it's amazing that that's still predominates the discussions about weight loss, and there's a lot of fat shaming going on in the world, not just from people looking at fat people, but from the fat person looking at the overweight person with too much adipose tissue, looking at themselves in the mirror and saying, I got to work out more, I got to work out harder, I have to eat less, and that's all I've got. And now I've got to go back to work and take care of my kids. What a vicious cycle that these people are in. And it's hard on everyone. It's just it's a crisis. There's no other way to put it. Your point, Steve.
Well, calorie balance, I agree. I agree with what they're saying, that the calorie balance model, as we said earlier, is completely wrong. He talked about a David Ludwig, and David Ludwig talked about people on a low carb diet losing weight. That being said, in the study that he wrote on that, he said, though studies characteristically suffer from poor long-term compliance. Why is that? Because you become having a craving for carbohydrates. So now let's say you're trying to do a keto diet, but that cake over there looks really good and you decide to indulge. You've now kicked yourself out of keto, and you have the worst of all worlds. You have a high fat in your diet where you now all of a sudden have this huge rush of carbohydrates, and carbohydrates and fats can help. The carbohydrates, which boost insulin, can help push that fat into your body. And that has been measured. Not only that, high fish, meat, when it's eaten with a carbohydrate, it spikes the insulin level and the glucose level much higher than if the carbohydrate, let's say mashed potatoes, if you eat fish with that, it boosts up the level of what you would have had the insulin response by about 3-fold. I'm going off of memory here. Maybe it's only 2.5-fold, but it was a huge spike. So you have to be very careful on that. Not only that, but there is an insulin response to all things. And if you look at, I mean, his whole thing is around an insulin-centric approach to model. And if you look at, there's an insulin index, and I'll send you the link to that. And you can look, let's say, white pasta, which I do not recommend. It is a processed food. It's not horrible compared to some other things, but it's not great. Has a lower insulin than meat. Okay, well, that's interesting. Doesn't mean that it's healthy. That being said, if you're going just on that model, we have to look at that. Now, it spikes your blood sugar more, but if you're looking just at insulin, you have to be very careful what you're saying, because he knows about the insulin index. It's not rocket science, and he's way too smart. So I'm not sure he doesn't discuss it so far in this talk. I'm sure, hopefully he'll get there, because that's important. The other thing is in his study that he funded, that where the researcher came out and said that it didn't support the insulin obesity model. One of the things that happened is people on a ketogenic diet, they did lose weight, but the weight loss slowed compared to a standard weight loss diet of a high carb, low fat weight loss diet. And when it went into a ketogenic diet, where it was also lower calories, same energy model, it cut the weight loss in half. But what they did notice is they lost a lot more water weight, and they started losing lean muscle mass, because it started cannibalizing the protein in your body. And that is not what you want to see happen. And that did not happen.
That was the keto diet that promulgated that.
That was the keto diet that Taubes funded. That was his study.
Loss of lean muscle mass.
Loss of lean muscle mass, exactly.
And how about Ludwig and the hungry fat cells in the abdomen areas? Is that something that you hold to?
I would hate to comment on it without more research on it. So I don't know about that.
So I guess we could say that according to Taubes and Hyman and perhaps Ludwig, a fat cell is not a fat cell. There are different kinds of fat cells that have to be examined and where they hang out, what promotes those specific fat cells to put more certain substances inside the fat cells. That's interesting. Okay, we'll get back to Taubes and Hyman here.
When insulin's elevated, the only calories you could burn for fuel are carbohydrates, so you're constantly hungry. So that's part of the vicious cycle. Back at the turn of the 20th century, when nutritionists and doctors first started thinking about what the cause of obesity is, it's funny in science, and my interest even more than nutrition is how science progresses and scientific thinking. And in science, the tools you have available determine what you can learn, right? So in physics, you get a bigger accelerator, you can learn more about the universe. In astronomy, you get telescopes that look in different wavelengths. You could learn different things about the universe, whatever you could see in that wavelength. And in nutrition, the only tool they had that seemed relevant to obesity was a device called a calorimeter, which could measure the energy expended by a human being, or could measure the energy contained in a food that the human ate. So they created this theory that obesity is caused by energy in being more than energy out. It seemed intuitively obvious because that's all they could measure. They couldn't measure.
It's a math problem. I mean, weight loss is a math problem. It's basically
weight loss is a math problem. So, and there are other people arguing, look, it's clearly a hormonal issue. It's like you look at men and women fatten differently. That's hormones. Like boys go through puberty, they gain muscle and lose fat. That's hormones. Girls go through puberty, they gain fat in specific places. That's hormones. It's all hormones, and it's just some people, they're going to get fat no matter how much they eat. Or the only way they're going to stop themselves from getting fat if they starve themselves.
Yeah.
And this was the German and Austrian clinicians who were doing the best medical science in the world at the time argued this. And it didn't matter. An American came along, a guy named Louis Newberg, University of Michigan, and claimed he had done the first experiment ever. This was 1930. And in this experiment, he proved once and for all it was all about calories. It's about how much you ate. And it was always about how much you ate. And no matter what the excuse, like, women, when they go through menopause, they gain fat. Now, animals, when they go through menopause, if you remove the ovaries from animals, they'll gain fat. And that was well known even in the 1920s. So it seemed to be a hormonal thing related to estrogen. But with women, it was about eating too much. They sat down with their lady friends and played bridge and ate bonbon. I mean, incredibly sexist explanations for why it's never hormones. And it caught on. It caught on in part because World War II came along and the German and Austrian researchers arguing the opposite vanished. They evaporated with the war.
So the Germans were the ones pushing that it's not energy balance. And because they were German and Nazis, we got rid of that theory.
We got rid of that. And it sounds like we're joking, but it's nowadays, I mean, it's very easy to demonstrate in the history. It's people cited Newberg. They didn't cite the German. Actually, the prime guy was an Austrian. He was a Jew named Julius Bauer. He fled to the U.S. in 1938, but the only job he could end up getting was he was one of the founders of the sort of endocrinology research in Europe. Very well known, pioneer in the field. Flees the Nazis in 1938 when they attack. They move into Austria. He ends up going to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He works at LSU for a year, and then he goes to L.A. and gets a job at the Hospital of Medical Evangelists. And he publishes papers like Julius Bauer, Hollywood, California, and nobody pays attention.
Yeah.
He's not at Harvard. He's not at Yale. He's not at Columbia. He's like, who is this?
But we've had decades of other research since then. I mean, there's been really well-designed, well-executed clinical trials by David Ludwig and others looking at this whole hypothesis of the
incredible researchers, pioneers landing in pseudo-obscurity unless they get lucky, all because of World War II. Fascinating stuff. Your point, Steve.
Well, he talked about the calorimeter and energy in and energy out, and we've kind of discussed that. I think we're all in agreement, or at least it sounds like you are, that is clearly a broken model. And he talks about it being clearly hormonal that's causing all of these things. And I would suggest to you that that is correct. However, we are built to be in homeostasis. If you look back at history, at the kings and queens and all the royalty, they were having 7-course meals. And if you go back, you can actually look at what they were eating. They were eating these humongous diets, and most of them were thin. You had King Henry VIII and Louis le Gros, or Louis the Fat, were outliers, but almost everybody at that time was thin. It might be big people, but they were thin, right? What's going on? They were clearly overeating more calories than what they need, and they were coming right back down. Well, let's unpack that. We have a system that's built to be in homeostasis.
Homeostasis.
Homeostasis. In homeostasis, we have a system in our body to be there, right? And if you look at your pH level of your blood, it's going to be at 7.35 to 7.45. And it's not going to change, because if you go out, you're going to die. And so your body will jump through. It doesn't matter if you have a ketogenic diet, even though that's very acidic, or if you have a whole food vegan diet, which is very alkaline, you're going to be right in there. Your body jumps through hoops to make it happen. Now, if you check with pH paper, your urine or whatever, you're going to see that you're very acidic or very alkaline. But that being said, your body stays in homeostasis. If you look at every other animal in the wild, they all do not have additional fat unless it's required for their lifestyle. Let's say if you're looking at a seal, it has way more fat than, say, a deer in the United States. A deer is going to be probably 3 to 5% fat. A seal is going to be, let's say, 30% fat. It is where they're built to be that way. You don't see a deer going on Weight Watchers or anything like that. They're always going to be right around that. However, animals associated with humans eating human foods are now getting fat. Infants are now getting fat. We have, I think I looked it up last night, 12% of children between the ages of 2 and 5 are considered obese. This is not because of somebody like not knowing what to eat. This is because they are thrown off. Their system is no longer regulating their weight efficiency. What could possibly throw out something? I'm going to give you a couple of possibilities because it's really key to understand. So one is BPA. You know, in like plastics, you get BPA-free bottles. Well, BPA is all over the place in our environment. And there was a study done where they checked all of these people, and every single one of them had detectable levels of BPA, even if people were going out of their way to try and avoid it. And in those, you had adiponectin, the obesity and diabetes hormone, being pushed down by being adjusted by the fact of what BPA somebody was eating. And that is, again, the obesity and diabetes hormone. That is where I believe our real problems lie. I believe we are built to be in homeostasis, and we can go outside of our normal diet. But when we're having endocrine disruptors or hormone disrupting compounds in our food, not necessarily from the fruit, not necessarily the meat itself, but what's in that meat, not necessarily what's on the wheat, but maybe it's because it's GMO or because it's got a chemical that's sprayed on it. You have things. That's why you're having frogs that are having the wrong sex being shown. It's because they're getting endocrine disruptors. And that is what I think is a much more plausible way of us getting overweight. I'll give you one other potential example. We fluoridate our water in the United States. In 2/3 of the United States is fluoridated. So what is fluoride? It's the most active substance on the periodic chart or periodic table. And if you look at it, it is a goitrogen. Goitrogen means it blocks the absorption of iodine. So does that make any difference? Well, your thyroid is really setting the tempo for your metabolism. As you're having more fluoride as a goitrogen, you're blocking your iodine absorption. And we've now gone from iodinized salt to sea salts and Himalayan salt, which has no iodine in it. Those are healthier salts, in my opinion, because the other one, most salt that's iodinized, is actually a synthetic form of salt. These other ones are healthier forms, but if you're missing the iodine, that can be a real problem. And especially with all of these goitrogens coming around, you can be very iodine deficient. What is the problem with that? You'd start developing a hypothyroid, and you will likely become more lethargic and start gaining weight. And that is just one of many things, or all these other things, electromagnetic frequencies and all these other things that can possibly throw you off. So that is where I believe it. Now, he talked about puberty. I agree with everything he said. Hormones are what cause those changes in both men or boys and girls, and clearly is the path of what we should be following. I learned a lot from this book, again, that I just showed you. It's an excellent book. I just don't agree with the conclusion, but he really spells it out very well, that it is a hormone problem. And I believe that's the case. He
Can you
talked
tell
about
us why you disagree with the conclusion in a minute?
Well, as I said, I don't think he talks in that book about going keto and eating a high fat diet. And in my opinion, that is a very dangerous diet. And I'll show you if I'm able to share my screen, I'll show you. Let me see if I can share my screen real quickly. Can you see that?
Yes.
So this is a study that was published, and it is all-cause mortality based on the dietary carbohydrate intake. And what you're looking at here is the percentage from carbohydrates here on the X graph, and on the Y graph here is the hazard ratio for all-cause mortality. So you can be hit by a bus, and that you're going to be put on here. Now, what you're looking at here is as this gets lower and lower carb, your all-cause mortality goes drastically up. And then as you're getting more and more carbohydrate, you also, once you get over about 55 or almost 60%, your all-cause mortality starts going up. So there is a sweet spot here, according to this study. It is a meta-analysis. It's a huge study. It's a peer-reviewed, published study that was done in 2018. To me, he's way over here at 5 to 10%. So this is where this one ends at 1.5 times the all-cause mortality. This is a substantial increase in a large study looking at all-cause mortality. This is incredibly important to understand. And it's the reason why Mercola, who wrote a book on ketogenic diets and came out recently and essentially said, I would highly recommend you do not do the ketogenic diet. It will put you in a hypoglycemic state, if I remember exactly his words, and it will, I think he used the words, kill you in the end. Because of this study, and I believe one others. He was very cognizant, but he came out and publicly disavowed what he was doing.
Disavowed his previous book and his previous videos.
Yeah. I think his publisher is still selling that book, but he's disavowing it at this point.
Wow. Interesting that they have the rights to do that, and he wants to pull it from the shelves or edit it. Okay, we just have a few more minutes on this video, and then we'll wind it down.
The carbohydrate insulin hypothesis of weight loss, which is a hormonal one, and what it really leads to in our thinking, and this is sort of striking to me. You know, researching some of my books, I discovered that if you're a kid and you're overweight, it's more of a stigma than if you're a kid and you're in a wheelchair and a quadriplegic. And we basically blame the person who's overweight for being fat. It's your fault you're fat. Just eat less and exercise more. And otherwise, if you don't, it's just because you're lazy and a glutton. And that fat shaming and that underlying approach is based on this idea of the calorie myth and that weight loss is just a matter of willpower. So why is willpower not the issue here?
Well, again, it's based on this energy balance idea. If the obese child, maybe he's 40 pounds overweight at age 12, that means his fat, he's been storing 50 extra calories of fat a year in his fat cells. So why can't they fix that? Why can't they just eat a little less, store a little less, or exercise a little more, store a little less? And it's the answer that lean people come to is, well, they must not care enough. If it's about energy balance, and I make this point in the case for keto, if it's about energy balance, that absolutely, that creates the concept of fat shaming, in effect. Because the assumption is always, if it's about intake and expenditure, then you should be able to take in a little bit less or expend a little bit more. It doesn't take a world of effort. We're talking about tiny numbers every day. So why can't people do it? And then you end up assuming it's because they don't want to.
Yeah.
Or they don't have willpower, you come up with. And it's interesting, by the 1960s, obesity research in the US was dominated by psychologists and psychiatrists who were trying to figure out how to get those fat people to eat less. Mm. I mean, they didn't care. The idea that they just have a fat storage disorder. We have a fat storage disorder. Just like if you saw somebody walking down the street who was 8 feet tall, you wouldn't think about how much they eat and exercise. You would think he's got some kind of growth hormone dysfunction.
Right.
Even if he weighed 400 pounds, which often if somebody's 8 feet tall, they're likely to weigh 300 or 400 pounds. You don't care about how much they're eating and exercising. You care about the growth hormone issue and growth hormone receptor. But here, they just didn't think like that. And once they didn't, and this is the danger in any sort of medical, scientific process. Once you assume something to be true based on an assumption, then it's going to infiltrate everything you do, and it's going to affect everything you do. So David Ludwig does these terrific, very well-designed experiments to suss out whether or not obesity is a carbohydrate insulin problem or a calorie problem.
Yes.
And for the most part, his work has sided with his own preferred hypothesis, carbohydrate insulin, but there are other people who think the opposite, who claim that their experiments are just as well designed.
Fascinating. And one other conversation I watched with Taubes, I probably watched in the last week, maybe 8 hours of Taube, and some of those videos I've watched twice, and I really like listening to him. I love the history. I love the fact that somebody's wrong in this story but doesn't want to admit it, even if the studies show that they should admit it. And I think Taubes is guilty of some of that himself. But he did say one thing that I think everyone who's doing the fat shaming should consider. When you have a Saint Bernard, known as a dog that could, have a lot of adipose tissue on them, you have a Saint Bernard or a Basset Hound, both wide body, heavy dogs, lots of fat. If you starve them, you do not get a greyhound. You get an emaciated Saint Bernard or an emaciated, what was the other breed I mentioned?
Basset Hound.
Have you heard that one before? Did you watch that video where he talks about that?
I've not seen that, but I think in this book here, Why We Get Fat, which is, again, an excellent book, he talks about genetically modified rodents where you can starve them to death and they will still die obese. And I think that's a good, because once you've been dysregulated, your body is cannibalizing your everything else to save your fat. Will they get thinner? Yes. But they will still die obese. And you'll see that their heart muscles have been cannibalized, their liver, their brains, they're all getting a lack of nutrients while their adipose tissue is being spared to a great degree, which is the opposite of what you normally find in nature. So he makes that point very clearly in there. And I think it's fascinating. And when you're making a rodent that way, where they're genetically modified to be obese, you are mucking with their hormones. You're not mucking with something else.
So, yeah, great point, Steve. The point I wanted to add on to your toxicity, BPA, and hormone disruptors is candida overgrowth, systemic candida overgrowth. So I've looked into that quite a bit. Lots of people I've talked to have had that. Candida is a yeast. It can infiltrate your system. It can clog up your nostrils. It can give you brain fog. Many of these things we're talking about can give you brain fog. Starvation can give you brain fog. Lying in bed all day and being obese can give you brain fog. All these things. But the Candida wants to be fed. It's a yeast that is demanding you and your neurology and your temptations to feed it. And the quickest way to feed it, especially if you're compromised in brain functionality and making the proper decisions and having urges and wanting to satisfy those urges, is sugar. And so if you do have a Candida overgrowth, the quickest way to satisfy that current urge, what you want to splurge on, is sugar. And you're going to pick quite often, especially people who are compromised, the one that's the most deleterious to your health. The processed cake, the Twinkie, whatever's easy at the convenience store. And when I was writing my book, Sedentary Nation, in the year of 2009, I believe it was, I called up 7-Elevens. I called up 5 different 7-Elevens around the United States, and I just asked the people working there, who were probably in that year making $12 to $14 an hour, and had, no stake in the game. This is their, get by job, or maybe it was their career. I don't know. I just asked them, I said, you have a minute for a question? They said, sure. Every one of them was nice. I said, do you have anything healthful that you sell in your store? Anything healthful? And they said, no. This is in 2009. He said, not one thing we sell is healthful. And then I went into a couple of 7-Elevens, and I did find in Santa Barbara, California, I found some bananas. They weren't the organically sourced bananas, and they weren't bananas that had been picked when they were relatively ripe. They'd been picked green and distant shipped and then gassed on the way to the store so that they would ripen. But they were in the store, and they were relatively not deleterious to our health, I would hope. So that's all I found about 10 years ago was the banana. I hope they have more healthful options now. Over to you, Steve, for some further points, and then I'll wind this down.
Well, so a few things in terms of the Candida. I've read 2 sides of that article or of that subject, and I don't have a firm conclusion my way on that. When my biggest concern with somebody that has an overgrowth, when I'm working with somebody that has an overgrowth of Candida, my biggest concern and what I look for is leaky gut. So that is what I'm looking at when talking with somebody with that, because that is one of the side effects of it. And of course, it can lead to some of those other things that you mentioned. That is my biggest concern, because once you have a leaky gut, it causes a cascade of events where you have autoimmune conditions and all these other things can just start springing up, and they're hard to pinpoint.
Inflammatory could cause leaky gut, I'm guessing, and could result in even more inflammation with leaky gut. Is that possible?
Well, so the Candida is in your gut can cause your body to have a leaky gut and create all of these different things. So yeah, it can be very inflammatory and help to create. I won't say it will. You have to be predisposed. Let's say MS or something like that. You have to be predisposed to that. And then you're getting hit on a daily basis with all of these things that your body is having a reaction to. And then for whatever reason, you either create something like type 1 diabetes if you're young and you're predisposed towards that, or you create, your body starts attacking the beta cells. That can be done with milk. So I'm going off the subject here, but let me respond to what they said. So one, he talked about the hormonal. I'm in complete agreement that this is the obesity with Taubes is a hormonal issue. So we're in total agreement on that. The kids and overweight, that fat shaming is horrible. I agree with him completely on that it's a shame, because when you're looking at somebody that's, 7 feet tall, or if they're, 5 feet tall, but they're 400 pounds, that is a dysregulation of the system. Something has thrown them off. Now they might be being triggered to eat a high carbohydrate or high fat, or to overeat, but that is regulated by hormones. So if you're looking at that, when it is a shame that we are fat shaming, because those people deserve to be helped just like they have any other issue. And by the way, the whole United States is becoming overweight and obese. I think it's now almost 80% of the United States is at least overweight, which is just on the path. And the last time the CDC put it out, it was 41.9% were obese. So, and that was 2017 to 2020. So we are going in this trajectory that is very unhealthy from that. And as we're having more things that are endocrine disruptors, we're having more and more people falling victim to gaining weight. And I think it's going to continue on. The last thing he said was on energy balance. And as we discussed before, I think that's a clearly broken model, and it has to do with what is throwing off our hormones. That's my last thing.
Okay. And so last thing I forgot to share about Candida, thanks for all that wrap up, Steve, is I think the number I saw in 2017 was 51% of Americans have a Candida overgrowth problem. Some of the causes of that: high sugar diet, toxicity, stress, poor sleep, liver issues, liver being fatty liver or other things that compromise the liver, and the internal organs can't process out the Candida like they do. And when they go on things to help their Candida, you result with a lot of dead Candida, which overloads the systems, and the system makes you feel horrible. And then you have to process out the dead Candida, the yeast. So it's a vicious cycle. And that's just one thing. We talked about a lot of things. We didn't talk about the general health of the microbiome, and the fact that having an improper gut with too many cells that are harmful bacteria in your gut, compromising your system, compromising your neurology, compromising your sleep, and the whole litany of things in your physiology. It can completely damage that relationship, and you're way off of homeostasis when that happens. So maybe we should do a talk in the coming months about the microbiome and what eating constantly all day and having sugary drinks constantly all day does to our microbiome. And even how, if you're doing everything right, eating your 2 or 3 meals, sleeping well, you can still have a problem with your microbiome. Many things that affect it. So let me know if you're open to share a discussion on that.
I am open, and that goes down a very interesting rabbit hole, because if you look at people that have done a fecal transplant, and they have the fecal transplant from somebody that's obese, they oftentimes become obese, and that's become a big issue. And now they're looking at doing it the other direction, where people that are obese, they're having a fecal transplant from somebody that's thin, because if you do that in a lab with rats, they adjust to what the fecal transplant was. Now, that only lasts for a certain amount of time. I'm not an expert in that subject. I've just gone down that path a little bit, but that is a fascinating path. And I'll be curious to see how that develops over time, because how easy is that? I mean, it's not inexpensive and everything, but for people that can afford it, doesn't that seem like a fantastic way in terms of at least starting the process of getting healthy?
Yeah. So I'm Sifu Slim at sifuslim.com, asking you to please like and subscribe. Take a look at my books, Sedentary Nation, The Aging Athlete, 2 different books. And Steve, do you want to share with us your website and anything else that you want to wind down with?
Yeah, I have a product, SOS Nutrients is the company name. So SOS and then nutrients.com. And what it is a whole food. The first product that's come out is a whole food smoothie additive. It has no flavorings or sweeteners, but it's all whole foods, and it's covering everything that their whole bunch of mushrooms, let's say. That's one component, a full serving of mushrooms, 2 grams of organic, high beta glucan, low starch. There's a full greens blend. There's a full berry blend. And the berry blend is organic, freeze-dried berries, all these exotic berries with specific nutrients. And I did this because, and it's covering things like your vitamin C level from whole foods, whole berries, instead of from ascorbic acid, or instead of calcium ascorbate or liposomal vitamin C, which are all synthetics, made as a base from high fructose corn syrup. Or, there's a natto for the vitamin A, which is instead of, a synthetic form of vitamin A, which can be made from beta carotene, which is created in many cases from a petroleum product or coal tar. So I've just tried to do everything from whole foods as opposed to it. Which is made in a lab by putting those two components together. I have a blend of 3 organic kelps from Iceland, which is far away from any industrialized center. And I'm trying to get things in a natural form, which is very gentle on the system. So again, if somebody's interested, check out my website. It's sosnutrients.com. And Sifu, thanks for having me on today. This was very fun and interesting to go over.
Aloha. Take care.